The man they judged. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a force that echoed across the quiet suburban street. "Don't ever come back here," Daniel Mercer shouted through the closed door. "People like you don't belong in my home." Silence followed. On the front porch stood an elderly man wearing a faded brown coat and worn leather shoes. His gray hair moved gently in the morning breeze. In one hand he held an old canvas bag. In the other, a neatly wrapped birthday gift that would never be opened. His name was Arthur Bennett. To every neighbor watching through half-open curtains, he looked like a poor old man who had come to beg for something. No one knew the truth. Arthur looked at the closed door for several seconds. His face showed no anger, no humiliation, only quiet disappointment. He whispered softly, "I hoped today would be different." Inside the house, Daniel laughed as he walked back toward the dining room. His wife, Emily, looked uncertain. "Daniel, maybe you were too harsh. He embarrassed us. He only wanted to visit. He looked like a homeless man." Emily hesitated. "He said he knew your company." Daniel rolled his eyes. "He also said he worked there years ago." Old people say strange things. The guests around the dining table chuckled. Daniel raised his glass, to success, and to never becoming like that old man. Everyone applauded. Outside, Arthur quietly placed the unopened gift on the porch. Then he walked away. Not once did he look back. 20 years earlier, Arthur Bennett had built one of the largest engineering companies in the country. But unlike many wealthy executives, he never loved luxury. He preferred simple clothes. He drove old cars. He spent weekends volunteering in community centers. His employees respected him because he believed every worker deserved dignity. When retirement came, Arthur stepped away from public life. Very few people knew what he looked like anymore. His successor insisted on keeping his name out of advertisements. Arthur was happy with that. He wanted peace. What he never expected was that one day he would be rejected because people assumed he was poor. The next morning, Arthur arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The security guards immediately stood up. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Good morning." Every employee who recognized him smiled with genuine respect. He wasn't just the founder. He was a legend. Even after retirement, Arthur still held majority voting rights through a family trust. He rarely used them, but legally, one signature from him could replace the CEO. Most executives had never met him. Daniel Mercer certainly hadn't. Daniel had joined only 4 years earlier. Fast promotions had filled him with confidence. He believed his talent alone had earned every success. He never asked who created the company. At 8:15 a.m., the executive board assembled. The directors whispered among themselves. "It's unusual. Why is Mr. Bennett attending today? He hasn't come in almost 3 years." Arthur entered quietly. Everyone immediately stood. Every director except one. Daniel remained seated while checking emails. Without looking up, he spoke. "Can we start? I have another meeting." The room fell silent. One director cleared his throat. "Daniel." He finally looked up. His expression froze. The elderly man from yesterday was sitting at the head of the table. Arthur smiled politely. "Good morning." Daniel blinked several times. His face lost all color. He looked around the room. "What is happening?" The chairman answered calmly. "Allow me to introduce the founder of this company, Mr. Arthur Bennett." The silence became almost unbearable. Daniel remembered every word he had spoken. Every insult. Every laugh. Every moment. His heartbeat accelerated. "No." Arthur folded his hands. "I believe we met yesterday." Daniel's mouth opened but no words came out. Arthur wasn't interested in revenge. He had attended the meeting for one reason. Character. For years he had quietly reviewed leadership throughout the company. Profits had increased, but employee satisfaction had fallen dramatically. Complaints about arrogant management kept growing. Anonymous letters described intimidation, fear, disrespect. Every report led to one executive. Daniel Mercer. Arthur wanted to see the man personally before making any decision. Yesterday had given him his answer. Arthur looked across the room. "Mr. Mercer." Daniel slowly stood. Arthur interrupted gently. "Yesterday, before asking who I was, you decided what I deserved." Daniel couldn't speak. Arthur continued. "You judged my clothes, my shoes, my age, my appearance." Then Arthur looked toward every executive. "I founded this company with one belief. People matter more than appearances." The room remained completely still. Arthur reached into his briefcase. He removed a thin folder. Inside were dozens of employee complaints. Some had names. Some were anonymous. Each described the same culture. fear, humiliation, threats. Arthur placed the folder in front of Daniel. I didn't come today because of what happened at your house. I came because yesterday confirmed everything these reports have been saying. Daniel slowly opened the folder. His hands trembled. Every page carried another accusation. Another complaint. Another warning. The room felt colder with every passing second. Arthur spoke quietly. This meeting is only beginning. Daniel realized. His worst day had just started. Daniel Mercer stared at the thick folder lying open before him. Every page seemed heavier than the last. Anonymous complaints, formal HR reports, resignation letters, and confidential interview summaries all painted the same picture. A manager who delivered impressive numbers but left broken trust in his wake. His throat tightened. This isn't the full story, he finally managed. Arthur Bennett looked at him calmly. Then tell us the full story. The boardroom remained silent. No one rushed to Daniel's defense. For years, his confidence had filled every meeting. Today, it had disappeared. Daniel took a deep breath. I pushed people because I wanted excellence. Arthur nodded slightly. There's nothing wrong with expecting excellence. He paused. But excellence without respect destroys people. The chairman slid another file across the table. This contains employee exit interviews from the last 3 years. Daniel slowly opened it. One former employee had written, I loved my work. I couldn't continue under Mr. Mercer. Another read, he never judged our ideas. He judged our worth. Another simply said, no amount of salary was worth losing my dignity. Daniel's hands began to shake. Meanwhile, at home, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man from yesterday. Something about his eyes had bothered her. They hadn't shown anger. They had shown sadness. She remembered the neatly wrapped gift still sitting on the porch. Curious, she stepped outside and picked it up. Attached was a small handwritten note. For Daniel, congratulations on your promotion. I was proud to hear about it. There was no signature. Emily carefully opened the package. Inside was an old leather notebook. Its first page read, Arthur Bennett, Company Journal 1989. She frowned. Arthur Bennett, the company's founder. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly searched the internet. A decades-old newspaper article appeared. There was a faded photograph. Despite being much younger, it was the same man. Emily covered, her mouth in disbelief. Oh no. Back at headquarters, Arthur stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. When I started this company, he said quietly, we had 6 employees. He smiled faintly. Our first office leaked whenever it rained. A few older directors smiled at the memory. We had almost nothing, but we promised each other one thing. Arthur turned around. No employee would ever fear walking into work. He looked directly at Daniel. Somewhere along the way, that promise was forgotten. The HR director stood. Mr. Bennett, with your permission. Arthur nodded. She projected several charts onto the large screen. Revenue had increased, but so had resignations, medical leave, stress-related complaints, internal transfer requests. Employee engagement scores had reached their lowest level in company history. One graph showed a dramatic decline beginning almost exactly when Daniel became regional director. Daniel stared at the screen in silence. For the first time, he couldn't argue with numbers. Arthur returned to his seat. I visited 3 of our regional offices over the last 6 months. Daniel looked up, surprised. I didn't introduce myself. I simply spoke with employees. He smiled. They thought I was another retired visitor. Several directors exchanged curious glances. I learned far more by listening than by announcing who I was. Arthur folded his hands. Do you know what one receptionist told me? Nobody answered. She said, our company used to feel like family. Now it feels like we're walking on glass. The room fell silent again. At that very moment, Emily rushed into her car. She drove straight toward company headquarters. She had only one thought repeating in her mind. Please let Daniel apologize before it's too late. Inside the boardroom, the chairman cleared his throat. There is one remaining item. Everyone understood. Leadership. Arthur slowly opened another envelope. I prepared this before yesterday. Daniel looked confused. Arthur continued. I hoped yesterday would prove these reports wrong. His voice remained calm. It did not. The envelope contained an official recommendation. Immediate removal of Daniel Mercer from executive leadership pending board review. Daniel felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. No. He looked around desperately. I've given everything to this company. Arthur answered gently. I don't doubt your hard work. But leadership is measured by the people who follow you willingly, not by those who fear disappointing you. Suddenly, The boardroom doors opened. Emily hurried inside. "I'm sorry for interrupting." She looked directly at Arthur. Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't know who you were yesterday." Arthur smiled kindly. "I know." She swallowed hard. "But that's not the part one regret." Everyone watched quietly. "I regret that we didn't treat you with kindness before knowing who you were." Arthur nodded slowly. "Thank you." Daniel looked at his wife in disbelief. She turned toward him. "You were wrong." He lowered his eyes. "I know." Arthur picked up the leather notebook Emily had brought with her. "You found this?" She nodded. "It belonged to me when the company had only 6 employees." Arthur opened to the first page. Written in faded ink were the company's founding principles. 1. Respect every person. 2. Listen before judging. 3. Character before profit. 4. Success means nothing if integrity is lost. Arthur gently closed the notebook. "I've tried to live by these words for 40 years. He looked at Daniel. "The question is, will this company continue living by them?" Every board member understood what that meant. A vote was coming, one that would determine Daniel's future. Daniel sat frozen, knowing the decision that awaited could end everything he had spent years building. And for the first time in his career, he realized that his greatest mistake had never been a bad business decision. It had been believing that power made him more important than the people around him. The boardroom was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. Daniel Mercer remained standing beside his chair, unable to look anyone in the eye. For years, he had walked into this room believing he controlled every conversation. Today, he realized he controlled nothing. Arthur Bennett folded his hands calmly. "I have no interest in humiliating anyone," he said. "But every leader must be accountable for the culture they create." The chairman nodded. "Board members, it's time to vote." One by one, the directors marked their ballots. No one spoke. Daniel's heartbeat echoed in his ears. After several tense minutes, the chairman collected the votes and handed them to Arthur. Arthur didn't open them immediately. Instead, he looked at Daniel. "If you could go back to yesterday morning," he asked quietly, "what would you do differently?" Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he answered without pride. "I would invite you inside." Arthur waited. "I would ask your name before judging your appearance." He paused. "And I would remember that every person deserves respect." Arthur nodded. "I believe you mean those words." Then he opened the envelope. The result was unanimous. Daniel Mercer was removed from his executive position, effective immediately. Daniel closed his eyes. The title he had spent years chasing was gone. But Arthur wasn't finished. "This decision is not punishment alone," Arthur said. "It's protection, for every employee who deserves to work without fear." The board agreed. Daniel quietly removed his executive access card and placed it on the table. No one celebrated. It wasn't a victory. It was a lesson. As Daniel left the boardroom, employees noticed something unusual. The confident executive who always walked with his head held high now moved silently through the hallway. People whispered, "What happened? Was there a board meeting? Is everything okay?" Daniel didn't answer. He entered his office for what he knew would be the last time. On his desk sat framed photographs of awards, conferences, and celebrations. For years, he believed those achievements defined him. Now they felt strangely empty. He packed only a few personal belongings. Everything else stayed behind. Arthur asked Emily to remain after the meeting. She looked nervous. "I'm truly sorry," she said again. Arthur smiled gently. "Yesterday hurt." Emily lowered her head. "I know. But what hurt most wasn't being turned away." She looked up. It was realizing how easily people judge someone by appearances. Emily wiped away a tear. "I wish we could change yesterday." Arthur nodded. "We can't, but we can decide what tomorrow looks like." That evening, Daniel returned home. The house was unusually quiet. The expensive furniture, polished floors, and elegant decorations suddenly felt meaningless. Emily was waiting in the living room. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I lost everything." Emily looked at him carefully. "No," he frowned. "You lost a position." She continued softly. "You haven't lost the chance to become a better man." Daniel sat down. "I don't even know where to begin." Emily placed Arthur's old leather notebook in front of him. "Begin here." Daniel opened the first page. The words Arthur had written decades earlier felt more powerful now than any leadership book he had ever read. Respect every person. Listen before judging. Character before profit. Success means nothing if integrity is lost. Daniel stared at those sentences for a long time. Then, quietly, he began to cry. Not because he had lost his career, but because he finally understood how many people he had hurt along the way. Across town, Arthur sat alone on the porch of his modest home. His longtime friend and former business partner, Michael Harris, stopped by. "I heard about today's meeting." Arthur nodded. Michael sat beside him. "Do you think he'll change?" Arthur looked toward the sunset. "I don't know, but people sometimes learn their greatest lessons after their greatest failures." Michael smiled. "That's why you never wanted revenge." Arthur returned the smile. "Revenge changes very little. What changes people is the opportunity to choose differently." The next morning, something unexpected happened. Daniel arrived at company headquarters, not as an executive, but as a visitor. He requested permission to speak with the employees of his former division. The board hesitated. Arthur agreed. "Let him speak." Hundreds of employees gathered in the auditorium. Many expected excuses. Others expected anger. Instead, Daniel walked onto the stage without a suit jacket, without applause, and without the confidence he once carried. He took a deep breath. "For years," he began, "I believed results were all that mattered." The room remained silent. "I was wrong." He admitted that he had ignored concerns, dismissed ideas, and treated people with less respect than they deserved. "I cannot erase what I did, but I can acknowledge it." Several employees looked at one another in surprise. One woman in the front row, who had once resigned because of his management, slowly stood. "I accepted another job because I couldn't work under you." Daniel nodded. "I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment. Then she simply said, "I hope you mean that." "I do." Another employee spoke. "If you had talked like this 2 years ago, many good people would still be here." Daniel lowered his head. "I know." Watching quietly from the back of the auditorium, Arthur smiled faintly. This was the first genuine humility he had seen from Daniel. The journey ahead would not be easy. Trust could not be rebuilt in a single speech. But perhaps, it could begin with one honest apology. As the employees slowly left the auditorium, Arthur turned toward the exit. He knew this story was no longer about ending a career. It was about whether a broken man could earn a second chance, not through power, but through character. 3 weeks passed after Daniel Mercer stepped down from his executive position. The headlines had faded, the gossip around the office had slowed, but inside Daniel's heart, the consequences of his choices were only beginning to settle. For the first time in nearly 15 years, he woke up without a meeting to lead, a department to oversee, or a title to protect. The silence in his home felt unfamiliar. One morning, he looked at the expensive watch on his wrist, the one he had once believed symbolized success. He removed it, placed it in a drawer, and left the house wearing simple clothes. Instead of driving his luxury car, he walked. His destination wasn't another company. It was a community center on the east side of the city. Arthur Bennett volunteered there every Wednesday. When Daniel arrived, he found Arthur arranging books on a shelf while several children laughed nearby. Arthur looked up. "I wondered how long it would take." Daniel looked surprised. "You expected me." Arthur smiled. "I hoped you would come." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I'm not here to ask for my job back. I know. I'm here because I don't know how to become the man I should have been." Arthur remained silent for a moment before handing Daniel a box filled with books. "Help me carry these upstairs." Daniel blinked. "That's it." Arthur chuckled. Every meaningful journey begins with something small. For the next several hours, Daniel carried boxes, cleaned classrooms, repaired broken chairs, and helped serve lunch. No one treated him like an executive. No one cared about his resume. To the volunteers, he was simply another pair of helping hands. An elderly volunteer smiled at him. "You're new." "Yes." "Good." She handed him a broom. "The floor won't sweep itself." Daniel laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh he had shared in weeks. Later that afternoon, Arthur invited him to sit on a bench outside. The children were playing soccer across the field. Daniel finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "Why didn't you destroy me?" Arthur looked toward the children before answering. "I could have." "You had every reason." Arthur nodded. "But if I had acted out of anger, I would have become the kind of leader I spent my life trying not to be." Daniel listened carefully. Arthur continued. "Consequences are necessary. So is mercy. The difficult part is knowing the difference." Daniel sat quietly, absorbing every word. Across town, something unexpected was happening inside the company. Without Daniel's intimidating management style, employees began speaking more openly. Departments started collaborating again. Suggestions that had once been ignored were finally being heard. Productivity improved, not because people were afraid, but because they felt respected. The chairman reviewed the latest employee survey. Morale had risen dramatically. He smiled. Arthur's decision had been difficult, but it had been the right one. That evening, Emily visited Arthur's modest home carrying a homemade dinner. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Arthur welcomed her inside. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She smiled softly. "I wanted to." As they shared a simple meal, Emily admitted something that had weighed heavily on her heart. "I think Daniel measured people's value by success because that's how he measured himself." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "Many people do. They believe love must be earned. They believe respect comes only after achievement." Emily whispered. "And when they finally achieve success, they forget how to see people." Arthur smiled gently. "Exactly." Several days later, Daniel received a phone call from a former employee named Sarah. Months earlier, she had resigned after repeated conflicts with him. "I heard about your speech," she said. Daniel took a deep breath. "I deserved everything people said about me." There was a pause. Then Sarah replied, "I don't know if I can forgive everything. I understand, but I wanted you to know something." Daniel waited. "I saw you helping at the community center yesterday." His eyes widened. "You were there. My nephew goes there." Another silence. "I hope you're changing for the right reasons." Daniel answered honestly, "I'm trying." She smiled softly before ending the call. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope, and hope was more than Daniel believed he deserved. That weekend, Arthur received an invitation to attend the company's annual Leadership Day. The chairman wanted him to deliver the keynote address. Arthur accepted. Employees from every regional office filled the large auditorium. Many had never seen the company's founder in person. When Arthur stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to its feet in a long-standing ovation. He waited patiently until the applause faded. Then he began. "When people tell the story of a successful company, they usually talk about profits. They talk about buildings. They talk about growth." He smiled. "I want to tell you a different story. A company's greatest achievement isn't the money it earns. It's the people it shapes." The audience listened in complete silence. Arthur continued, "Never judge someone by the clothes they wear. Never assume kindness is weakness. And never believe a title makes you more valuable than the person standing beside you." Near the back of the auditorium stood Daniel. He hadn't come as a speaker. He hadn't come as an executive. He came simply to listen. As Arthur's words echoed through the hall, Daniel realized something profound. Losing his position had not been the worst day of his life. It had been the day his real life finally began. A month after Leadership Day, Arthur Bennett received another invitation from the board of directors. This time, it wasn't about business. It was about the future. The company had launched a new leadership development program centered on the 4 principles Arthur had written decades earlier. Respect every person. Listen before judging. Character before profit. Success means nothing without integrity. Every new manager would be trained under those values. Arthur smiled. "If those principles outlive me, then my life's work was worthwhile." Meanwhile, Daniel continued volunteering at the community center 3 days a week. He never asked for recognition. He never mentioned his former title. One afternoon, a young boy struggled to fix an old bicycle. Daniel knelt beside him. "Need some help?" The boy nodded. Together they repaired the chain. When it was finished, the child grinned. "Thank you, mister." Daniel smiled back. "No, thank you." Arthur had been watching from across the yard. He quietly realized that Daniel had finally learned what leadership truly meant, helping someone when there's nothing to gain. Several weeks later, the board invited Daniel to return, not as an executive, but as a mentor for young managers, sharing the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his career. Daniel hesitated. "I don't deserve that honor." Arthur answered gently. "Perhaps not because of who you were." He smiled. "But because of who you're becoming." Daniel accepted. His first session wasn't about profits or strategy. It was titled, "The Cost of Judging People by Appearances." He told the story honestly. He admitted his failures. He spoke about the elderly man he had turned away at his own front door. The room was silent. Many young managers later said it was the most powerful leadership lesson they had ever heard. That evening, Daniel and Emily visited Arthur's home together. This time, Daniel wasn't carrying pride. He was carrying a simple homemade dinner. When Arthur opened the door, Daniel quietly said, "May we come in?" Arthur smiled warmly. "I was hoping you'd ask." They shared a long meal filled with laughter instead of tension. Before leaving, Daniel handed Arthur a small wrapped package. Inside was the same leather notebook Arthur had given him months earlier. On the final blank page, Daniel had written, "You didn't end my career. You saved my character. Thank you for teaching me that respect is earned by how we treat others, not by the position we hold." Arthur closed the notebook, his eyes glistening. "That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." A year later, the company celebrated its anniversary. Employees from every office gathered for the occasion. Arthur, now older and walking with a cane, was invited to speak one last time. He stood before hundreds of employees. "My friends," he began, "people often ask what the secret to building a successful company is." He paused. "The answer is simple. Buildings grow old, technology changes, markets rise and fall, but kindness," he smiled, "kindness never goes out of date." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Daniel was the first to applaud, not because Arthur had once been the founder, but because he had become the mentor who changed his life. As the celebration ended, Arthur and Daniel stepped outside together. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold. Daniel looked at Arthur. "Do you think people can truly change?" Arthur smiled. "I do, not because they avoid failure, but because they choose to learn from it." Daniel nodded. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving that lesson was worth learning." Arthur placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I believe you will." The two men walked toward the parking lot, not as strangers, not as rivals, but as friends who had both discovered that true success is measured not by wealth, status, or power, but by the respect, compassion, and integrity we show every person we meet. 2 years had passed since the day Daniel Mercer lost his executive position. The company had changed in ways few people thought possible. Employee turnover had fallen to its lowest level in more than a decade. Teams collaborated openly, new ideas flourished, and the culture Arthur Bennett had dreamed of 40 years earlier was finally alive again. Arthur, now in his late 70s, rarely visited headquarters. His health had slowed him down, but his influence could still be felt in every hallway. Every new employee received a small card during orientation. It contained only 4 sentences. Respect every person. Listen before judging. Character before profit. Success means nothing without integrity. No one was allowed to begin leadership training without reading those words. Daniel's life looked very different. He never returned to an executive office. Instead, he accepted a role as director of leadership development, mentoring future managers. On the first day of every training program, he told the same story. "I once believed expensive clothes, a large house, and a powerful title made someone important." He paused before continuing. "I was wrong. The room always became silent. I turned away an elderly man because I thought he looked poor. He smiled sadly. That man built the company I worked for." The lesson stayed with every manager who heard it. One afternoon, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. A young man in his 20s stood at the front door. "My name is Ryan." Arthur welcomed him inside. Ryan looked nervous. "My father worked here years ago." Arthur nodded. "He often talked about your kindness." Ryan smiled. "He passed away last year." Arthur's expression softened. "I'm sorry. My father asked me to give you this." Ryan handed Arthur an old photograph. It showed 6 employees standing in front of a tiny rented office. Arthur was one of them. On the back, Ryan's father had written, "The greatest boss I ever had treated everyone with equal respect." Arthur held the photo for a long moment. No business award had ever meant as much. Months later, the company celebrated Arthur's 80th birthday. No luxury decorations, no grand speeches, just employees, former colleagues, their families, and friends gathered in the company courtyard. Daniel stepped onto the stage. "Years ago, I thought Mr. Bennett ended my career." He smiled toward Arthur. "I was mistaken. He ended my arrogance, and because of that, he gave me a better life than I ever could have built for myself." The audience applauded. Many wiped away tears. Arthur slowly walked to the microphone. "I don't want people to remember me as a founder." He looked across the crowd. "I hope they remember me as someone who believed every person deserves dignity." He smiled warmly. Because one day, the person you overlook may be the very person who changes your life. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Daniel joined them, clapping with gratitude. As the evening came to an end, Arthur looked around at the smiling faces. The company had become more than a successful business. It had become the kind of family he had always hoped to build. And Daniel had learned the lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life. Never judge a person's worth by their appearance. The greatest power is not the ability to end someone's career, but the wisdom to change someone's heart. 3 years passed. Arthur Bennett had almost completely stepped away from public life. At 81, he spent most of his time tending a small garden behind his modest home, reading books, and volunteering at the community center. One quiet morning, Daniel arrived with coffee. "You still beat me here," Daniel joked. Arthur laughed. "Old habits." The two men sat on the porch, watching children play across the street. Suddenly, Arthur's phone rang. It was the chairman of the company. "Mr. Bennett, we have a serious problem." A global competitor had offered to buy the company. The offer was worth billions. Several board members wanted to accept immediately. Others feared that thousands of employees would lose their jobs after the acquisition. An emergency board meeting was scheduled. Although Arthur was retired, everyone wanted his advice. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. One director stood. "This is the highest offer we've ever received." Another replied, "But what happens to our employees?" The room fell silent. Arthur slowly stood. "When I founded this company," he said, "I didn't dream of creating the most expensive business." He looked around the room. "I dreamed of creating the most trusted one." He paused. "If selling the company means abandoning the people who built it, then the price is too high." Daniel listened carefully. Years earlier, he would have focused only on the financial numbers. Now he asked a different question. What guarantees can we secure for every employee? The discussion changed completely. Instead of talking only about profits, the board negotiated protections for workers, pensions, and long-term employment. Weeks later, the buyer agreed to every condition. Not a single employee lost their job. The company kept its values. The board unanimously thanked Arthur. After the meeting, Daniel walked beside Arthur. "You've taught me something again." Arthur smiled. "And what's that?" Daniel answered. "Real leaders don't ask, 'How much money will we make?' They ask, 'Who will be affected by our decision?'" Arthur nodded with quiet pride. "Then you've learned the lesson I hoped would last." As they stepped outside, hundreds of employees greeted Arthur with applause. Years ago, people had judged him by his worn coat. Today, they honored him for the life he had spent serving others. Arthur smiled humbly. "My greatest achievement was never building this company." He looked at Daniel and the employees gathered before him. "It was helping build people who would protect it long after I was gone." The crowd erupted in applause, knowing they were witnessing not just the legacy of a founder, but the legacy of a man whose greatest success was measured by character rather than power. 5 years had passed since the day Daniel Mercer slammed the door on Arthur Bennett. Life had changed in ways Daniel never imagined. The company was stronger than ever, employee satisfaction had reached record highs, and the culture Arthur had fought to protect had become its greatest strength. Daniel had rebuilt his reputation, not with power, but with humility. Yet Arthur knew there was one final lesson he wanted to leave behind. One autumn morning, Arthur collapsed while working in his garden. His neighbor immediately called an ambulance. Within an hour, Daniel, Emily, and the company's chairman were standing anxiously outside the hospital room. The doctor finally stepped out. "He'll recover," the doctor said, "but he needs plenty of rest." Everyone sighed with relief. Several days later, Arthur asked Daniel to visit him alone. When Daniel entered the room, Arthur smiled warmly. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel pulled up a chair. "How are you feeling?" Arthur chuckled. "Old." The two men laughed. Then Arthur reached into the drawer beside his bed and removed a sealed envelope. "I wrote this years ago." Daniel looked confused. Arthur handed him the envelope. "Don't open it until I'm gone." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Please don't say that." Arthur gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We all leave someday. What matters is what we leave behind." Months passed. Arthur recovered enough to return home, though he no longer traveled. Instead, people came to him. Young entrepreneurs, students, former employees, and community volunteers all visited the modest house with the white porch. They came seeking business advice. They left having learned lessons about kindness, humility, and character. One winter evening, the company celebrated its 50th anniversary. Arthur insisted on attending despite his fragile health. As he slowly walked onto the stage with the help of his cane, every person in the ballroom rose to their feet. The applause lasted nearly 2 minutes. Arthur smiled. "I don't deserve this." Someone from the audience replied. "Yes, you do." Laughter filled the room. Arthur looked around one last time. "I've spent my life building a company." He paused. "But today I realize, I never built a company. I built a family. Many employees wiped away tears. 6 months later, the news everyone feared finally arrived. Arthur Bennett had passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was surrounded by the people who loved him most. The entire city mourned. Thousands attended his memorial service. Former employees traveled from across the country just to say goodbye. Many brought stories instead of flowers. Stories of scholarships Arthur had secretly paid for. Families he had quietly helped. Employees whose lives he had changed without ever asking for recognition. After the service, the family attorney approached Daniel. "Mr. Mercer." He handed Daniel the sealed envelope Arthur had given him months earlier. Daniel sat alone beneath an old oak tree before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, my journey has ended. Years ago, you believed I had the power to end your career. The truth is, anyone can end a career. Very few people can help rebuild a life. I forgave you the moment I saw genuine regret in your eyes. Never stop becoming the man you chose to become after your greatest mistake. One day, someone else will fail. When that happens, don't ask whether they deserve another chance. Ask whether someone once gave one to you. That is how kindness survives from one generation to the next. Your friend, Arthur Bennett." Daniel could no longer hold back his tears. For a long time, he simply sat beneath the tree, holding the letter against his heart. The following Monday, Daniel gathered every employee in the company's headquarters. Standing beneath a large portrait of Arthur Bennett, he unfolded the letter. Without changing a single word, he read it aloud. By the time he reached the final sentence, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then Daniel looked at the hundreds of employees before him. "I was once the man who judged someone by his appearance." He paused. "Because of Arthur Bennett, I became someone who now judges people by their character." The room erupted in heartfelt applause. Arthur Bennett was gone, but his greatest legacy wasn't the company he founded. It was the thousands of lives he had changed, one act of respect, one lesson in humility, and one second chance at a time. 1 year after Arthur Bennett's passing, the company prepared to unveil a bronze statue in the headquarters courtyard. The inscription was simple: "Respect as the greatest form of leadership, Arthur Bennett." Employees, retirees, and their families gathered for the ceremony. Daniel Mercer stood before the crowd, holding the same worn brown coat Arthur had been wearing on the day he was turned away. "I asked his family if I could keep this," Daniel said quietly. "To remind me never to judge anyone by what they wear." The audience stood in silence. After the ceremony, Daniel returned to his office. On his desk was a letter with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mr. Mercer, 10 years ago, you fired my father without listening to him. He came home believing his life was over. Last week, I heard your speech about second chances. I don't know if my father would have forgiven you. But I wanted you to know. I have. People really can change. Ethan Collins." Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he quietly placed it beside Arthur's notebook. It was another reminder that healing often takes years, but it is possible. A few weeks later, Daniel was invited to speak at a national leadership conference. Business leaders from across the country filled the auditorium. Many expected a presentation about strategy and profits. Instead, Daniel walked onto the stage carrying an old brown coat. The audience looked puzzled. He placed the coat over a chair. "This coat," he began, "once belonged to the greatest leader I have ever known." He paused. "I almost never met him." The room became silent. Daniel told the entire story, from the day he judged an elderly visitor by his appearance to the day he learned that the visitor had built the company. When he finished, no one applauded immediately. The silence itself was a sign of how deeply the story had touched everyone. Then the audience rose together in a standing ovation. Months later, the company announced a new annual award. It wasn't named after the top salesperson. It wasn't named after the highest performing executive. It was called the Arthur Bennett Character Award. The award recognized one employee each year who consistently treated others with kindness, humility, and respect. The first recipient was a cafeteria worker named Maria. She had quietly paid for meals when struggling employees couldn't afford lunch. She had never told anyone. The company found out only because dozens of employees nominated her. When Maria accepted the award, she said through tears, "I didn't think anyone noticed." Daniel smiled. "Arthur always noticed people like you." Late one afternoon, Daniel visited Arthur's grave. He placed fresh white flowers beside the headstone. "I still make mistakes," he said softly. "But every day I try to remember your lessons." A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Daniel smiled. I hope you'd be proud. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young father walking with his little daughter. The child pointed at Arthur's headstone. Daddy, who was he? The father smiled. He was someone who believed every person deserves respect. The little girl nodded thoughtfully. I want to be like that. Daniel quietly wiped a tear from his eye. Arthur's legacy was living on, not just in a company, but in the hearts of people who had never even met him. As the sun set behind the trees, Daniel looked back one last time. Years earlier, he had slammed a door on a man wearing a worn coat. That single moment had changed his life forever. And because Arthur chose forgiveness over revenge, thousands of others would benefit from the lesson for generations to come.